In the year 2008, Electronic Arts unleashed a pair of games that continue to resonate with fans even today. The gorgeous Mirror's Edge from DICE, and Visceral Games' Dead Space. As a dark sci-fi horror experience, Dead Space quickly amassed a following and would go on to receive multiple sequels and spin-offs. Despite its success, however, after the third game, the series was shelved. Now, in the year 2023, Dead Space lives again thanks to EA Motive. In this full-on remake, Dead Space merges many of the latest innovations of the Frostbite engine with a fresh new coat of paint and overhauled game design. But just how much has the game truly changed, and what does this technology bring to the table? That's what we're here to find out. In creating this video, I had an opportunity to speak with two key figures from EA Motive who shared deeper insights into the technology used to create Dead Space, which we'll be discussing today. Next, I'll investigate and explain the issues with image quality that are extremely apparent, especially on PlayStation 5. Then, I'll take you on a journey through the first hour of this new game, directly comparing it against the original game running on PlayStation 3. Curious to see what's changed and how it stacks up to the original? Then this segment is for you. With all that in mind then, let's get started. The original Dead Space comes from an unusual place. It was built from the technology powering the Tiger Woods games, created between the year 2000 and 2007. But despite this rather unusual connection, it's a very different experience. Beautiful, dynamic shadows and moody lighting help to create a memorable and atmospheric journey for players. And perhaps most surprising of all, it managed to run equally well on both Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, a rare feat for the era. Through a modern lens, Dead Space does show its age, but what the team managed to create at the time remains surprisingly striking even now. Since its release, however, technology has evolved significantly. 2 console generations have passed, and the Frostbite engine has become the de facto solution for most of EA's studios. It was a perfect time to revisit the series. According to senior producer Philippe Ducharme, from the beginning the goal was to completely rebuild the original game using the Frostbite engine while respecting its legacy. It would include modern graphics features such as vastly improved lighting and atmospherics, but one of the driving factors was to create a singular, seamless USG Ishimura. The Ishimura would no longer be divided up into sections, rather the player can now freely explore, and the game would need to be balanced to take this into account. Technical director David Robillard noted that, prior to this project, seamless fully streamed environments were not a strength of the Frostbite engine, and in fact in building Dead Space, many people were pulled in to make it work. This not only serves the project at hand, but should also benefit future Frostbite games as well. Once we get to the comparison section, you'll see more of this in action and how it differs from the original game, but this is really one of the biggest changes. The ship was rebuilt in such a way that it's now more physically plausible. The team actually created a gray box version of the Ishimura using the original map assets from the 2008 game. It quickly became evident that many aspects of the original ship design simply didn't make sense when presented as a whole. What this means in practice is that the Ishimura now feels more spacious and logical in its design, yet still feels true to the original. One interesting example, in the original game, the medical center that appears in chapters 2 and 5 are completely separate maps. They essentially mirrored the geometry and then made changes to suit the different chapters. In the remake, however, all of this is integrated into the singular environment, and layers are used to change the environment based on player progression. Of course, transforming the ship into a fully seamless environment required some changes to the way encounters play out. As you explore and re-explore areas of the ship, enemies can and will attack you at random, or at least it might seem that way. You see, this is in fact the result of what the team calls the Intensity Director, which ties directly into the new level streaming in how they handle the player. According to David, they've essentially broken the ship up into detached sublevels, and each of these sublevels can have further subdivisions within it. Level data is streamed in and out based on camera and player position, and the rooms the player inhabits all have logical meta information which the game can track. By tracking or monitoring the progress and position of the player then, the game can basically spin up any number of events ranging from simply rattling a nearby vent to sending swarms of enemies their way. Seamless level streaming and the intensity director then are the two key elements which really define this remake. These have a huge impact on the overall pacing and feel of playing Dead Space, and I think overwhelmingly it's a very positive change. And this brings us to our first comparison point with the original 2008 release of Dead Space. So, early in the original game, once you've replaced the broken tram car and installed the data board, you'll be asked to make your way to the medical sector. In the original version, once you reach the flight deck's tram station, you're presented with a shop here on the right, or the workbench against the far wall for upgrading your equipment. The only way forward at this point is using the tram system itself. So you climb aboard, activate the central panel, and the game begins to seamlessly load the next chapter. It's well executed, but in reality you're basically watching a loading screen between the two different tram stations. Once the loading completes, the camera then pulls out and you'll find yourself at the medical tram station where you can continue your journey. In the remake, however, notice how upon arrival at the flight deck tram station, the bench that was previously situated against the leftmost wall has been replaced with a door. Inside you'll find that missing bench, along with an elevator. Hop on the elevator and you'll find yourself in a completely new and seamless section of the ship, and it's here that you'll also gain access and learn to utilize the kinesis power, which allows you to manipulate objects.
I just move shit with my freaking mind!
Eventually you'll make your way up this ramp, enter this door, and, look familiar? It's the medical tram station. What was once just another store terminal in the original game is now a doorway leading to the prior sector. Once here, you can unlock the tram, which then becomes available just like the original game, although the difference there is that it never actually relieves the player of control, so the tram itself winds up feeling a lot more seamless in practice. Also worth noting that this is the station where players are granted access to kinesis in the original game. This is basically just one example of how the new seamless ship design has altered the pacing of the game. Furthermore, if you decide to backtrack through these sections, the intensity director ensures that your experience will differ each time. Cool, right? Of course, changes to the game design are one thing, but there's also a visual component to discuss. After all, a remake needs to offer superior graphics, and thankfully, that is indeed the case here. The thing is, when recreating a classic game using new technology, you need to figure out which tools suit the intended visual design. Frostbite itself offers a wide range of solutions, and EA Motive has selected many of its features to bring the ship to life. There's a lot of tools in this toolbox, it's how you use them that matters. Now obviously, lighting and materials play a huge role in defining the texture of the ship. Physically based rendering wasn't even really a thing back in 2008, but it's standard practice now, and as a result, all art assets created for Dead Space benefit. From the metallic surfaces to the fleshy tendrils adorning the walls, everything feels far more natural and realistic as a result of this shift. Alongside this, the geometric complexity of everything in the world has been massively scaled up. There's just so much more detail in any given scene, and to push things even further, most loose objects scattered around the world now have actual physics simulation. They can be picked up and moved around, and this adds some additional dynamism to the overall combat. Another key element then is the volumetric lighting. And this is a huge departure over the original game, which instead relies on billboards positioned to give the impression of volumetrics. With the remake, the team deploys Frostbite's excellent frustum-aligned voxel fog, and it's used just about everywhere. From shafts of light piercing the darkness to the low-hanging mist nestled along the floor. It's a significant part of the visual makeup, and it looks really nice. Furthermore, special consideration was paid to how the volumetric lighting reacts in a zero-G environment. Given that numerous scenes throughout the game can transition between these two states, it was pretty important, and it does work rather well. Another detail I wanted to mention is the way in which a light beam interacts with glass surfaces. Note here how the flashlight beam both projects upon and through the glass surface of this tube. It looks great, doesn't it? In addition, they also revamped the particle system. Not only are particles beautifully rendered as you'd expect from Frostbite, but they also physically interact with the environment and objects around you. Here's one example. Note how the sparks actually bounce off Isaac's suit here, leaving the small residual markings across his armor. Now, this same approach to physicality actually applies to audio as well. According to Philippe, a lot of time and effort was poured into audio engineering and creation. Now, of course, straight away I noticed that Dead Space makes great use of surround sound audio, which is not always a given these days, and it includes exceptionally deep bass if you're rocking a subwoofer. Of course, the 3D audio when using headphones is also rather effective, but I'm more of a home theater user myself. What impressed me more though is the simulation of sound propagation. You see, when a sound is produced in the game, this sample is processed to simulate the distance, velocity, and direction of travel. Like, let's say a sound plays the other end of a curved hallway. It'll actually realistically bounce around the environment before being played back for the player, more realistically simulating the behavior of sound, basically. It makes a big difference, I think. Furthermore, David mentioned that they've implemented a system in which the sound samples are all normalized, kind of like how materials are normalized in a PBR pipeline. Things like mass, surface, and surface contact points are all taken into account when the sound is played back, to ensure that it respects the physical properties of the world, and yeah, it does make a big difference. Now, shifting back to visuals again, I wanted to mention the lighting. So nearly every light source in the game can now cast a shadow, ensuring a far more coherent presentation. In the original game, this really wasn't true. There were definitely dynamic shadows used throughout, but not every light could actually cast a shadow. That was just a little bit too much for that generation of technology. That's no longer the case here. Furthermore, if you're using the quality mode on consoles or playing on a nice PC, the game employs Frostbite's ray-traced ambient occlusion, which adds depth to the various crevices around the ship and simulates more how lighting behaves. Now, of course, this is not as robust as the RT reflections and shadows that you get in the Callisto Protocol, I'd say, so don't expect a major transformation, but it does definitely enhance overall fidelity. But it also means that you can opt for the game's 60 frames per second performance mode on PS5 or Xbox Series X without sacrificing nearly as much in the way of visual quality. Speaking of consoles, I do want to touch on image quality here for a moment, and one of the features that perhaps doesn't perform as well as I'd have liked. So firstly, Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 both offer a performance mode, and the option to disable performance, which in fact is a quality mode with RTAO, a frame rate capped at 30 FPS, and a higher resolution. What is that resolution? Well, it basically is said to target 1440p in performance mode and 2160p in quality, using FSR2 of course, but we did find much lower pixel counts throughout thanks to dynamic resolution scaling. Now this is actually a pretty big shift for a Frostbite engine game, as until this point, most games relied on the checkerboard rendering feature of the engine. I have my feelings on FSR2 as it's used on consoles, but really in this case, the resolution isn't the real issue. No, the actual problem here relates to variable rate shading. Now this is a buzzword you may have heard around the launch of the new consoles, but the idea is to save on performance by varying your shading rate dynamically across the frame, sort of based on what's being displayed. Conceptually, the renderer should retain the full shading rate of 1:1 pixel for well-lit areas, while darker scenes can use the reduced rate with larger 2x2 or 4x4 blocks. The feature is enforced across every single platform, however. But the software VRS solution utilized on PlayStation 5 has a serious problem. It basically ruins image quality. Here's an example of what I mean. Essentially, darker areas of the image use more extreme VRS, resulting in serious pixelation, which actually also seems to scale with the internal rendering resolution. The result is this messy, noisy, pixely look in all of the shadowed areas of the game, and there's a lot of shadow in Dead Space, of course. If you look closely, it almost resembles something you might have seen on the Switch, kinda like Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. It's definitely not a good look. The good news is that the dev team has officially acknowledged the issue and are working on a patch to improve things on console while offering the option to disable VRS entirely on PC. So with any luck, this issue will be sorted soon. If you can't wait for that patch though and need to make a choice right now, I'd recommend playing on Xbox Series X over PS5. But if you're looking for a more comprehensive comparison between consoles, Oliver will be releasing a video one day after this one, so keep an eye out on the DF channel. I, however, would like to move on to comparisons against the original game, examining how the visuals and the design changes impact the opening hour of Dead Space. We'll begin here during the game's introduction. It's an excellent sequence and one of the few lengthy cutscenes in the game that slowly builds tension as you make your way towards the Ishimura itself. The first difference you might pick up on is that Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist. For this remake, they recruited the same voice actor behind Isaac's performance in Dead Space 2 and 3, where he was no longer silent. As a result, all the dialogue and animations during this scene are completely different between the two games. Eventually, once the ship quote-unquote docks, you'll step out into the hangar, where another change becomes immediately evident, and this is something that applies to much of the game. The hangar space is now significantly larger. The walkway leading to the ship's interior is several times longer than the original game. Pushing forward then, we enter the waiting room, which benefits from all the new VFX, including volumetrics, but it's also clear that, once again, there's a difference in scale. This room in the remake is larger, which, coupled with the wider FOV, increases the overall sense of scale and place. It's a marked improvement, I think. Shortly after, the crew is attacked and Isaac must flee from an incoming threat, which highlights another minor change. In the original game, the elevator at the bottom of the slope is closed upon arrival, requiring you to press a button to initiate it, run inside the elevator, turn around, press another button. In the remake, however, the elevator door is awaiting your arrival, so you just run in, press the button, and trigger the next sequence. In that sequence is the Necromorph attack, which plays out similarly between the two versions, but the gore factor is cranked up significantly in the new release, complete with dripping blood as the door snaps shut. Once you arrive at the bottom of the elevator shaft, then another difference becomes clear. This is the point where you first find your weapon, right? And in the original, you simply walk up to it, press the use button, and this tutorial prompt appears. In the remake, however, a full animation has been created showcasing Isaac piecing together the cutter before being handed control. These sorts of minor interstitial cutscenes are present throughout the game, and they're a nice touch that adds extra context and polish to the experience. Now if we move forward, this next section demonstrates changes made to the core level design. In the original, you navigate an S-shaped corridor with a single exit point. Once you exit that door then, there's a downward ramp to the left leading to a blocked passageway. In the remake, this passageway is moved, occurring immediately after the first bend and before you enter the door. This section is also tied directly into another hallway that you'll traverse later on. Eventually, you arrive in the tram control room, which exhibits a significant boost in fidelity as you can see. But once you receive your goal, this junction highlights our first major shift in overall design. So basically, you're tasked with fetching a data board and swapping out a damaged tram before you can proceed. Now in the original game, when you leave the control room, you can choose to go left or right. If you try to go left first, however, you'll simply encounter a blocked door with no obvious way to open it just yet. So instead you double back and take the path leading to the right, which takes you down a covered ramp and out into the tramway tunnel. From here you find this door slamming rapidly, and just before it is situated the stasis power, which is necessary to bypass obstacles like this. You then make your way to the tram replacement room and complete those steps. Only after completing this objective can you make your way back to the other end of the hallway, where you can now open the door. So this whole sequence offers the player little choice in terms of which objective to tackle first. So how does the new game handle it? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that the passage to the tramway tunnel is now accessible from within the control room itself, and the hallway adjacent to this room only has a single direction you can travel, with the right side being blocked. But there's a difference. At the end of the hallway, you'll find this new puzzle device. It's a circuit breaker system. Enable one side, and you'll gain access to a previously locked door back down this hallway. But if you go back to the circuit board and enable the other option, you gain immediate access to the data board room, which, by the way, is connected directly via this entry point. Whereas in the original, when you do visit this space, it's connected by a loading elevator instead. The point here is that you could either go fetch the data board first, or replace the tram first if you prefer. You're now given a choice as to which order you complete your objectives. It's a major shift in the design that really enhances its feeling of place. The tram replacement puzzle then is virtually identical between the two versions, but the data board area has been completely revamped. The specific room containing the data board has now been moved, and opening the door to the data board room requires you to manipulate a circuit breaker once again, which in turn cuts all the lights in the area, allowing for increased horror action. Eventually then, you'll accomplish both objectives and make your way back to the control room, initiating the process. This is the same in both versions, and after completing it, you'll need to make your way back to the docking bay. But once you arrive at the Kellyan, this shows how the presentation differs again. In the original release, you just walk into the ship, press a button, watch as the ship catches fire, and then turn around and leave. This is when a cutscene is initiated, blasting you back onto the platform. In the remake, however, additional context and dialogue are used to better explain just what the heck is happening. The cause of the explosion becomes clear, and the resulting cutscene is, well, significantly more explosive, I'd say. Now from this point, you're tasked with making your way over to medical, which is where our previously mentioned difference comes in. You remember, right? In the original game, you need to take a tram with a loading screen to reach this point, while the remake allows you to walk there first through an entirely new section before activating the tram, allowing for a more seamless experience. Once you begin to explore medical then, the differences will continue to stack, and it continues much like our prior examples. The game is more seamless and expanded in all directions. And that's really the key here. The Dead Space remake makes a lot of changes to the overall design, while still adhering to the game's original structure. It walks this fine line between authenticity and discovery. Over the course of the game, encounters you may have anticipated happening don't happen, items are moved around, and everything just feels like it's playing with your expectations. Newcomers likely won't think much of it, but anyone that's played the original should find this rather thrilling. I know I did. Which brings me to my final thoughts. Despite the glaring issues with variable rate shading plaguing the launch version, everything else is an example of what a best-in-class remake looks like. Dead Space is absolutely on par with the likes of Capcom's Resident Evil remakes, offering something for fans and newcomers alike. Now, visually speaking, it doesn't match the heights of the Callisto Protocol, mind you, but it's still a handsome game with smooth performance across every console, and the changes made to the Frostbite engine to allow this game to work should benefit future Frostbite projects. Ultimately, if you enjoy sci-fi horror, you need to give this one a shot. But that's all for now. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.